Hello again. Recovery Cafe is now a cornerstone in my life, and I am grateful for it. So it is a privilege for me to introduce the visionary leader of Recovery Cafe, the woman whose dream has become a reality through the cafe. Every time I talk to her, she fills me with a little bit more hope and light. Killian, no.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. A couple of days after I fell into a deep pit, my friend Mike, who lives in Washington, D.C., called me at Harborview Hospital and said, "Some people will do anything for a good standing in the Gap illustration." So Mike and all of you gathered for the 10th Standing in the Gap event. Here's what I've learned from falling into a deep pit. First and foremost, no one gets out of a deep pit on their own. Over the past 6 months, I have paid special attention to stories about pits. My favorite is from the Hebrew Bible, the story about Jacob, who was thrown into a pit by his brothers and left for dead. All of the members of Recovery Cafe have at some point found themselves in the deep, dark pit of addiction and/or some other mental illness. Most believed they had been left for dead. But for 10 years, you, the supporters, you, Mary Crow and Ruby Takushi, you, the partners, you, the volunteers, you, the members of Recovery Cafe, have refused to walk past women and men suffering at the bottom of the pit. You have heard their cries. You have allowed your hearts to be broken by their anguish. You have climbed carefully down into the pit alongside them. You have cradled them in your arms. And then, as Miss Mary said, love has lifted thousands of women and men who thought they'd been left for dead. You understood that for 9 out of 10 of Recovery Cafe members, the fall to the dark bottom of the pit began with early childhood abuse. And that the climb out of that pit requires more than a few expensive hours in an emergency room during a mental health crisis. You understood what is essential for healing of multiple trauma wounds is a place where women and men can become deeply loved and deeply known. A place where they can serve, grow, contribute to the healing of others, develop their own gifts, and fulfill their God-given potential. So today, especially, we celebrate each one of you who has made this extraordinary healing community a reality. Which brings me to the second thing I learned from falling in a deep pit. Well, you didn't think I was just going to squeeze out one talking point, did you? From that experience, the second lesson I learned from falling in a pit is that life can change in an instant. You could be strolling along, not paying attention, and in an instant, your life can change and be totally different than it was before. Time is not promised to any of us. The wise learn from their time in a pit to live each day with the same compassion, generosity, and presence They would choose to live if they knew it was their last day. We must love more deeply and daringly, for only what we do for love lasts beyond this brief life. Our relentless pursuit of things and sensation may numb our existential despair, but it does not bring us lasting joy. Which brings me to the third thing I wanted to say about time in a pit. Everyone either has already or will at some point experience time in a pit. Maybe your pit was a painful divorce, a traumatic betrayal, a life-altering illness. Maybe your pit was the loss of a job or the loss of a dream. We don't usually get to choose the pit we find ourselves in, but we can choose our response. We can become bitter or better. We can allow the pain to shut down our hearts or break our hearts wide open. If we allow it, all the things in our life we would never have chosen can make us more aware of our deep connection with every other member of the human family. If we allow it, our pain can make us more conscious of those whose pain is beyond our imagination. If we allow it, our time in whatever pit we find ourselves can result in our becoming contributors to the healing of others. You know this. It's easier to look away from the suffering of others because their suffering reminds us of our vulnerabilities, which we would rather ignore. This past July, Bernie and I traveled to the East Coast and visited my 92-year-old father, who now lives in an assisted living facility. Over the course of a few days, we met some of the other seniors living in that facility. We were taken by a woman who suffers from Alzheimer's and lives down the hall from my dad, Mrs. Crawford. Every day after lunch, Mrs. Crawford put on a bikini and sunned herself in the courtyard of the assisted living facility. I admired Mrs. Crawford for not caring what others thought of her body mass index or her age, both of which were on the high side. Then, on our last day visiting my dad, we learned that many of the residents had signed a petition to forbid Mrs. Crawford from ever again donning a bikini and enjoying the warm sun on her skin. We wondered, what was it they feared? Was it Mrs. Crawford's behavior they feared, or did they fear losing control of their own behaviors? As a society, a common fear-based response to the most vulnerable is out of sight, out of mind. Most people, for example, are not conscious of the fact that 52% of all inmates in state prisons throughout the U.S. are suffering from at least one diagnosable mental illness, and over half of those inmates have never received treatment for their mental illness. That is not only cruel, it is costly. According to the executive director of the Global Mental Health Program at Columbia University, and I quote, "Mental illness is the leading cause of disability worldwide. It costs more to ignore mental illness than to treat it. When we fail to treat people who suffer from mental disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, addiction, and major depression, we all lose. The economic burden associated with health problems, lost productivity, lost lives is more than 10 times the budgets now being spent to treat people with mental illness. That is totally unacceptable. We must do better. And we can do better because models of cost-effective, compassionate, healing, recovery communities like Recovery Cafe already exist. We must build on that foundation. With the support of some officials from the state and the county who are here today, Recovery Cafe has stepped into a leadership void in our state. In November, we are convening a 2-day gathering to create an organizing body which will support healing communities throughout the state. Recovery Cafe's model has already been replicated in a handful of cities, but over the next 10 years, we are determined to package and share this model more systematically. Like Habitat for Humanity, which started in a small town in Georgia, Americus, Georgia, and has spread to communities throughout the world, the special sauce of Recovery Cafe is desperately needed across the U.S. and beyond. That's one of the many reasons to put your weight down with the Recovery Cafe for 10 more years. And with this, I close. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk who was nominated by Martin Luther King Jr. for the Nobel Peace Prize during the Vietnam War, wrote this: "It is possible that the next Buddha or the next Christ will not take the form of an individual, but will take the form of a community practicing understanding, loving kindness, and compassion. Building these kind of communities may be the most important thing we can do for the survival of our world."